Donald Trump is having a disastrous Saturday morning. He is having a horrific meltdown before our eyes after losing the case in front of the Supreme Court where they struck down his tariffs against the world. As you may recall, yesterday Donald Trump posted that he would be imposing a new tariff regime of 10% tariffs against the entire world. He's invoking something called Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, which I'll describe later in this video, actually doesn't apply. It's another unlawful invocation of a law which is not being invoked properly to impose tariffs against the world. But this morning, he now raised that to 15%. So within about a 12-hour period, he went from having his meltdown over the Supreme Court ruling and saying, well, now I'm doing 10% tariffs against the world, to now he says he's doing 15% tariffs against the world. Here's what he posted early this morning. He goes, based on a thorough, detailed, and complete review of the ridiculous, poorly written, and extraordinarily anti-American decision on tariffs issued yesterday after many months of contemplation by the United States Supreme Court, please let this statement serve to represent that I, as President of the United States of America, will be effectively, immediately raising the 10% worldwide tariff on countries, many of which have been ripping the U.S. off for decades without retribution until I came along, to the fully allowed and legally tested 15% level. During the next short number of months, the Trump administration will determine and issue the new legally permissible tariffs, which will continue our extraordinarily successful process of making America great again. Extraordinarily successful. Inflation is surging again. We got the new PCE report on Friday, core PCE around 3%. We got the GDP numbers on Friday. GDP was a lousy 1.4%. Very bad GDP growth during Donald Trump's first year in office, and you were promising 5, 10, 15% growth. Far worse. The economy is far worse right now than under former President Biden. And now you're putting 15% tariffs against the world. As this one account explains, it's really infuriating also that every journalist since Trump's 2024 campaign has been incorrectly discussing Trump's tariffs as though there's some economic policy. They're not. They're a primitive coping mechanism employed by a psychopathic toddler to soothe his pain when he feels fragile and wounded. There has never been a clearer example. The Supreme Court humiliated Trump by saying publicly that he doesn't have absolute power to do anything he wants. He felt wounded, so he lashed out at SCOTUS to hurt them back by imposing a 10% tax on Americans. What the F are we talking about? Budget impacts, this or that. Donald Trump is just making this stuff up to soothe his ego, and then he just raised those tariffs against the world to 15%. And again, I'll explain to you shortly again why it's illegal. I just want to cover some other things with you as well, because now the United States ambassador to the European Union is also threatening the EU if the European Union adds in its defense procurement directive a preference to buy and build European weapons over U.S. weapons. So after the Trump regime, J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, has been attacking Europe, I mean, quite physically attacking, quite literally attacking Europe, but saying you need to stop being dependent on the United States, you need to be more self-reliant, and then Europe and the rest of the world goes, bet, okay, we'll do that. We will prefer European weapons over American weapons. We will prefer our own defense over the former kind of global security alliances, which, by the way, benefited the U.S. monetarily. Now, this just happened. The European Union ambassador from the United States attacks the EU for preferring EU equipment over the United States in its defense directive. This was a statement that was just issued by the U.S. ambassador to the EU. The United States opposes any efforts to incorporate European preference in EU defense procurement directives. We fully support European rearmament and a revitalization of the European defense industrial base. However, European preference in the directive would undermine member state flexibility to make national procurement purchases, hinder European rearmament efforts, and create barriers for allies reaching NATO capability targets, and run counter to European commitments in the 2025 US-EU Joint Statement on Trade and Reciprocal Defense Procurement Agreements. Yeah, they don't want to buy from the US anymore. Even if the US weapons were technically better made based on the fact that Europe had not been really building out its industries the same way the US was. Donald Trump's been talking about kill switches. He's been threatening to invade Greenland and NATO nations and saying Canada's the 51st state. Why would they want to prefer American weapons over EU? This is a natural consequence of Trump's attack on Europe and the rest of the world. This account puts it perfectly right here. So, the country that, checks notes, threatened to invade European territory for a month, implied multiple times that it might not support militarily its NATO allies in case of invasion, launched a trade war specifically because it was unhappy Americans were buying European products rather than US, sabotaged military contracts of European allies only to fail to deliver on its own promises, has extensive legislation itself mandating US administration buy American, is now complaining that Europe dares to prioritize its own industry to reduce its military reliance on a partner that has been less and less behaving like an ally and increasingly like a threat. Yeah, thanks for your input, United States, but we'll put it into our pocket reserve for the very important stuff. Or this account writes, the US administration has spent the past year alternating between threatening to invade Denmark and bragging about selling us F-35s with kill switches, now finds itself shocked, I tell you, that Europe no longer wants to spend tens of billions of dollars on US weapons as the Trump regime threatens to retaliate against European countries if the EU favors domestic weapons makers in a drive to rearm the continent. This is what you reap, Trump regime. This is what I've been saying now on the Midas Touch Network since the Trump regime started this when they came into power. I've been saying, and this is what Justin Wolfers and I talk about all the time. You can't even look at a specific quarter GDP, although it's bad when you look at a quarter GDP or when you look at some of the smaller data sets of quarterly information. The long-term damage that Trump has done to the U.S., the fact that U.S. treasuries are no longer even viewed